In relation to the Deputy Premier, the majority of the questions, though not all the questions that I had for her, were in relation to the government's handling of the university merger process. The government came to office with an election promise to set up a university commission which would explore the benefits, potential opportunities of a university merger, what sort of merger would be appropriate for South Australia, what that would look like, how it might be achieved for the best interests of the people of South Australia. The day before the estimates process questions happened, the Deputy Premier, the Premier and the Vice-Chancellors of the Universities of Adelaide and South Australia outlined an entirely different process to the election commitment, a proposal for a university merger between those two universities, negotiated behind closed doors with the government, with the investment of $440 million of South Australian taxpayer funds. And so obviously the following day was the first opportunity to probe in detail, as much as was possible, the Deputy Premier about the detail of how that was being rolled out. I was really disappointed by some of the answers we got, and I don't want to go through every issue that was raised, but I'll highlight a couple of issues. One of the principles of good government is that the government, acting on behalf of the people of South Australia, would take into consideration their interests, the costs and risks that would go alongside the benefits and opportunities of any project prior to making a decision. And what became very clear through the Deputy Premier's evidence, and has become more clear in the weeks subsequent, has been that that work wasn't done by the government in relation to this decision. Now, I'm not preempting whether or not it's a good decision or not. There's a committee investigating that. The Liberal Party will go through its own process. We are open-minded, sir, about whether it was a good decision. But what was clear is that the government process was deeply, deeply flawed. And I'll highlight one thing. The business case, it's been described also as the feasibility study, but effectively the university has described it as a business case, a risk register. All of that work that was considered by the university councils in helping them make their decision on whether this was a good idea for their institutions, that was not read by the Premier or the Deputy Premier, as became very clear through this estimates process prior to the government making the decision to proceed with this plan, this investment of nearly $500 million in South Australia's money, taxpayers' money. And we'll get to talking about the money, but perhaps even more importantly than the money, the consequences of the decision for the future of South Australia. Now, if the opportunities are realised in full and we can have confidence that they will be fully realised to the extent that it has been claimed, then that's a potentially good thing. If indeed the financial and economic benefits to South Australians and the new university is more than the sum of its parts, then that's potentially a good thing. If critically the student experience and the vocational outcomes of students who have undertaken study at the new potential future university, or the Adelaide University as it's to be called, if their student experience and their learning is of a higher quality than can be delivered at either of the existing institutions were they to continue, then that would be a good outcome. And it has been put to us by the Premier and the Deputy Premier that this is a foregone conclusion. But good governance would require somebody to at least explore whether the assumptions they're making are accurate. It's not as if this was an election promise, that there will be a merger come hell or high water the people of South Australia have voted on, and that's the scrutiny process. No, because that wasn't the election promise. The election promise was for there to be a universities commission to do that very work, to explore those opportunities, and critically alongside those opportunities, the risks that have been in the public domain for some time now, the risks that the general experience of the student experience and vocational outcomes at larger institutions is less good than those at smaller institutions. Now, that's not in every case, and certainly Vice-Chancellor Peter Hoy, and I commend him for his work at the University of Queensland, he cites that as an example of where the opposite is true. But it has certainly been put as a risk, one worth considering. It has been put as a risk that while ultimately scale may well, and not everyone agrees, but certainly let's accept that scale were to lead to improved opportunities for research funding and potentially improved, therefore, rankings in the international rankings in the long term. Under any scenario, it's suggested that there's going to be transition pains and transition cost. And the question is whether that transition cost, over whether it's 5 or 10 or 15 years, before you get to that optimal outcome in the 2030s for the university, is that transition cost worth more than the benefits? The universities say no, and that's certainly their view from their point of view. But it's the responsibility of good government to make the decision on behalf of South Australia's point of view. We don't just take the word of third parties when the request comes in to support them financially with $440 million without doing due diligence. The due diligence in this case that we're asked to accept is that the Premier and the Deputy Premier's word is enough. During estimates, I asked the Deputy Premier, has the Minister read the business case that was prepared by the universities in relation to informing their decision to proceed with the merger? The Deputy Premier said, look, there are a number of items of documentation that I think could be referred to. There's a feasibility study, as I understand it, whether it is the business case, feasibility study, whatever the title is, that went to the two councils that contains all of the case and a significant amount of commercial and confidence material. I have not received that full document. Later on, we explored this further. I asked, has anyone in government been provided with that business case? The Minister said it was a document that was provided to the councils because they have a fiduciary duty to make a decision about what is in the interests of their institution. So it's quite likely that it would have material that was shaped for the purpose of considering each individual university's future, and they may not have been the same document. The answer is no, if anyone was unclear. Later I put it to the Minister, to put it more clearly, the business cases the universities provided to their councils were to work out whether they considered it as being in their interest to proceed. The government's job is to work out whether it is in the interest of South Australia to proceed. This is a different question. And the Deputy Premier a little later said exactly, and I think you made the point I was seeking to make earlier. So the Deputy Premier and I were on the same page to an extent, but the page is really worth questioning. The point that was being made is that the university councils, and I have absolute confidence in good faith with lots of information that has not been released to the public, have made a decision that's in their interest to merge on the basis of the $440 million in government funding. But what impact does that decision, that government decision, not the university's decision, but the government decision, what impact does that have on Flinders University if one institution is to get funded and the other is not? What impact does that have on local communities in the eastern and northeastern suburbs of South Australia who are going to be dramatically impacted if the land currently used as the McGill campus is to be sold for what is it to be sold for? The government hasn't even said. But certainly development having impacts on amenity, on traffic, on infrastructure and lifestyle in those areas, and areas that have been subject to the most significant urban infill of potentially any part of Adelaide that's not a greenfield site over the last 10 years, particularly as a result of the John Rao planning era. Those impacts are dramatic. But then we get back to the significant issue, the issue that, thankfully, the Parliament in its wisdom has seen fit to establish an inquiry with wise parliamentarians such as yourself, sir, to explore all of that work that should have been done by the government prior to the commitment of $440 million, of whether it is in the state's best interests, whether the risks have been considered, and if necessary, mitigation strategies put in place to avert the outcomes of those risks, not just for the government's investment, but for the thing itself, of whether the question is, the very question that is this merger in the best interests of South Australia? Because when you take away existing institutions that are training, giving university qualifications to more of our professionals, our teachers, our medical professionals, our scientists, our engineers, than any other institutions. That's also the output of the university, not just profit that they make or how many international students they can bring in to cross-subsidised research, as has been put. It's actually also an extraordinary piece of human capital that comes out of these institutions. Professor Lloyd and Professor Hoy are highly regarded, well-respected and deeply intelligent, deep thinkers in Australia's university scene. That is not in question. And they've made a decision that's in their university's interests to proceed down this path with this government investment. But this estimates procedure, this estimates hearing, made it very, very clear the responsibility that is on all of us as legislators as we're considering a bill that apparently will be coming any day now from the government as to whether it's in the state's best interests. And we should all take an open mind to that and seek out the evidence, and the evidence thus far hasn't been provided, but I thank the universities for their acknowledgement that there will be more information to come. I look forward to seeing it. Also, during the estimate session with higher education, the Deputy Premier and I discussed issues relating to government commitments on scholarships, and indeed those scholarships that were promised by the government at the last election that are now starting to be rolled out. We have high hopes that they will indeed attract more people to the teaching profession, for one. There is a significant level of need for more teachers in our system, and that is going to be exacerbated. That challenge will be exacerbated. That opportunity potentially will be exacerbated by the decision of the government to proceed with the Royal Commission's recommendations in relation to 3-year-old preschool. And that model, and the modelling done by the Royal Commission, suggests that our shortfall at the moment is about 140 teachers in early childhood alone. There's also many, many teachers required in country areas and schools across South Australia, and hundreds more. In addition to that current shortfall, and that current shortfall of hundreds more non-teaching qualified staff to meet the needs of 3-year-old preschool, there is also a requirement of 880 more diploma and certificate qualified staff, 120 directors and other staff, and another 660 teachers. We're talking about a need for more than 2,000 extra teachers over the next 3 years to meet the government's election commitment, in an area where in the earlier childhood education space, we currently have 2,000 early childhood teachers in South Australia. The government has set itself a task, and indeed, I think the several dozen scholarships in question may help. I wish them well.